Thank you everyone for coming. It's really great for me to be here. I used to live in New York. I miss New York, so this is really exciting. Frederic was my most important teacher when I was living here. Chris is actually the first person who published an article of mine when I was broke and living here and younger, and so I have very special attachments to both of these people. So we have a short amount of time for reading, and I'm going to just read a little section of my book, which will hopefully give you an idea of the mood that we're in. This is a story about a teenage girl that moves with her family from Rome to Los Angeles, and her father has aspirations to kind of make it big in Hollywood, and he brings his family to live in Los Angeles to make it big in Hollywood, but they're actually not living in Hollywood. They're living in a really horrible part of Los Angeles that's called Van Nuys. I don't know if any of you have ever been there, but it's the porn capital of America, or it was at least in the 1970s. It's where Boogie Nights takes place. So it's kind of a little bit not a really fun neighborhood to be living in, especially when you're 15 and moving from Rome. So there's a definite, the book starts with a bit of a disappointment. And the parents of the protagonist, whose name is Eugenia, are convinced that they can sort of squeeze their Italian lifestyle into California law system, which is very rigid and very different. So they're sort of hippies, and they are also nudists, and they go to a California beach and decide to just sunbathe naked. And the children are slightly embarrassed but used to this. The grandmother who's traveling with them is also topless. So the girl is sort of annoyed by her parents. She's a teenager, and she decides to leave her parents, her naked parents, on the beach, and she wanders off and goes to a skate park where she hopes to find some more interesting people to hang out with. I climbed over the cliff and walked along the freeway back to the skate park we passed earlier. I leaned against a wall of arid earth, looking at the skaters rolling up and down the ramps in hypnotic loops. There were girls on bleachers in skin-tight t-shirts. They had pigtails and sucked on lollipops. I felt the cold wind against my skin. Nature in California was hostile and unforgiving. But the skaters, so vigorous, their hair so blonde, it was almost white, didn't seem fazed by it. The girls' legs were strong, legs that surfed and pushed boards against thrusting water, legs that could keep a violent nature at bay. I looked at my own skinny, pale limbs, bruised and covered with goosebumps, and I closed my eyes. Dear Mary, I need your help. Speak to this ocean, these waves, the wind and the sun. Tell the city to smooth its edges, to show me some kindness, to give me something to hang on to. Dear Mary, appear to me in all your beauty. Make it good, or at least better. Amen. Since we'd moved, the Virgin Mary had become my role model. Being away from the motherland called for motherly reassurance. And since I wasn't getting it from my own creator, who could be better than the mother of all mothers? I asked her daily to perform miracles for me as auspicious signs that would cancel out the bad omens. Sometimes I felt like she listened. The wind blew hard. I put my hoodie on, and suddenly the heavens opened with a roaring sound. Mary had heard me. I knew it. The sound became stronger. The skaters stopped skating and looked up at the sky. She was coming for me. She was going to take me away. It was the sound of a helicopter floating above the beach where my parents were reading out yard sale listings. From the loudspeakers came the voice of God. It said, "Put your bathing suits back on." I repeat, put your bathing suits back on. You are committing a felony. Ma'am, put your top back on. Dear Mary, I closed my eyes and kept praying. Tell me this isn't happening. Tell me a policeman is not telling my grandmother to put her top back on. Dear Mary. Help. The skaters started laughing. One of them rolled his pants down, extracted his big cock, and waved it around towards the helicopter. Want me to put my bathing suit back on too, officer? His friends rowed their boards down along the coast to see the nudist outlaws from the top of the cliff. I didn't want to go. I couldn't. So I stayed there, staring as the helicopter picked up dust and sand and landed on an opening by the beach. I imagined my parents getting handcuffed and deported, and me condemned to stay alone on that beach forever. Maybe I would fall in love with a skater and we could hitch a ride to San Francisco. I heard that it was more of a European city. But did I want that? To betray my family so soon after our arrival? I ran back to the beach. From the street above, the skaters laughed and screamed at my grandmother. Sexy granny, take it off, take it off. A police officer was writing out a ticket as my family stood half-dressed and bewildered before him. What happened? I asked when I finally reached them. The officer was explaining to us that we can't be naked here, my grandmother whispered in a sultry voice, trying to give herself a distinguished British accent. She thought that by proving her, in her mind, superior European heritage, the cops would be more lenient. But the policeman stared her down and nodded his head. Italians, huh? The British affectation had failed her. You guys like your topless tans? Well, we're in Los Angeles now, and if you're going to lay naked on a beach, you have to take responsibility for things that might happen. But what's the worst thing that can happen, sir? Nudity is only natural, my father replied with a Gandhian smile. It was so like him to try to get a muscle-bound authority figure to level with him in his down-to-earth way. The cop slid his sunglasses down his nose. The worst thing that can happen, sir, is that a maniac could be standing right on top of that cliff, looking at you naked people, masturbating and traumatizing children and civilians. I tried to imagine a pervert jacking off to my grandmother's formless bosom. I've seen it happen, he confirmed, noticing my doubtful expression. My brother looked at me and rolled his eyes. This is a warning. Now don't let me find you here without bathing suits again. And ma'am, he said, turning to my grandmother, who, speaking not a word of English, sat on a rock with furrowed brows. Don't you know sun is carcinogenic? At your age, you should be guarding certain delicate private parts. I don't understand you, and I think you are an ugly asshole, my grandmother replied in Italian. He tilted his head and climbed back up the cliff to the helicopter landing. The pilot revamped the engine. The blades spun and the heavens roared. The officers flew above my now fully clothed parents towards the ocean. If this isn't another bad omen, I don't know what is, I screamed at my parents. Ma'am, put your top back on, ma'am, my father replied, doing a nasal policeman impersonation. It's not funny, Dad. Oh, come on, get a sense of humor. I hate you. I hate this beach. I hate the city. I want to go back to Rome. I want to go back to Rome as well, my brother interjected. My father put his arm around us and started walking. Let's get out of here, kids. These people are fascists.
It's hard to top that. I was trying to think of things that our books had in common, and there are many, but I totally forgot that one of them is, it starts with toplessness on a beach. My book also has a topless woman, younger. It's such an honor to be here, and that is one of the best prologues, your book, that I've read in a very long time. My book is going the opposite direction, from America to Europe. Most of it takes place in Greece or New York, a beautiful island called Patmos, which is mostly famous for where the Book of Revelation was written, but is also an amazing vacation spot. A lot of this happens on a vacation. The other part happens in New York, all very decadent, but I'm going to ruin that and read the only part that is set in Michigan. Because the only unsexy part of my whole book is very short. And, hold on, let me find it.
Read the sexy part.
Yeah, just... No, I'm changing it to this, and I haven't read this aloud before, so pardon me if I stumble. Okay, so Ian is the main character. This is all first person from him. He's fallen on bad times. He's sort of embarrassed himself, can't get a job, has been cut off from his family, and goes to Patmos to his best childhood friend who's rich for help. But this is a memory of his family, of going back to his family when his grandfather died, and I thought it fit the yearbook because of weird families. Okay.
What do you mean?
I mean perfectly normal ones. Okay. When my grandfather died in 2006, my father, half-sister, half-brother, and I flew to Michigan for the funeral. We watched a meteor shower rain sideways through the night over the parking lot of the airport Marriott. And the next day, we watched the casket lower into Muskegon Holy Catholic Cemetery, besides my grandmother's grave. After that, to our surprise, there was very little of my grandfather to dispense with. What did remain barely filled a few swept rooms of his white Sears Roebuck farmhouse. Most of his clothes had already been folded into grocery bags and labeled for pickup by St. Vincent de Paul. The inventory of his kitchen cutlery consisted of 1 fork, 2 spoons, a butter knife, and a can opener. The refrigerator was bare, the shelves glowing antiseptic white like mopped hallways in a hospital, and his other appliances were stowed with their power cords covered around their bases. Post-it notes on his television, radio, and electrical panel, turn on water heater 10 minutes after pump, gave insightful instruction to anyone who cared to operate them. When we phoned the gas company to cancel service, we discovered that my grandfather had already terminated his contract. His propane tank had been filled in the spring, and he told the technician to discontinue annual services. Every bill was paid, every signature witnessed, and belatedly, one day after the Requiem Mass, Lex found, that's his younger sister, a list of funeral songs to which he'd always had a special fondness. When we opened the barn, I half expected the original boxes of the 1934 kit house to be stored inside, waiting for the dismantled parts to be returned to manufacture. My father took pride in the man's foresight to dwindle down the baggage of his estate. So considerate, your grandpa, so like him not to be a burden. He wanted to go as easily as he came. Did you ever hear him once complain about his years of serving in Korea? He barely mentioned it, even when I was little. It just was, no whining. I hope you'll always think of him that way. Simple, clean. There was no denying that he had gone easily. Clean. Really, all that was needed was a realty sign in the front yard, and the entire Bledsoe foothold in Muskegon County would disappear, like a few uncharacteristically mild days in a long and sweltering summer. Lux, Russ, and I, however, found the whole thing creepy. Clearly, our roomy-eyed, semi-nude grandfather had made a hobby out of his death preparations. And if he hadn't been felled by a heart attack in the meat aisle of IGA, we might have suspected suicide. It proved difficult to mourn a relative who had drawn such scrupulous plans for his own non-existence. And deprived of grief in our week-long visit, we devolved into greedy grandchildren. The three of us, or really me versus my half-siblings, fought like rival heirs over the smallest, cheapest, post-it-less artifacts. A cracked softbound Bible, a collection of pewter tie clips, a pane of stained glass that might have actually just been a shoddy hardware store patch job. We ran through the rooms in a frenzied game of hide and seek, except ours was find and keep. Ross got the tie clips, Lex received 2 oak rush chairs that my grandmother had hand-braided, and I was directed toward the attic to claim my inheritance that my father felt it deserved. That's the real prize anyway. You love history. Do I? Well, more than your brother and sister. The triangular attic doubled as a rodent hospice. Amid piles of bright blue poison pellets, the brown mice that hadn't yet succumbed were flinching and twisting in their final death throes. In the corner sat a cardboard slit spear box that was filled with newspapers and magazines. It rattled with mouse poop as I carried it down the ladder. The box contained a century of headlines, and I dealt them out one by one across the kitchen table, realizing my grandparents had spent their entire lives collecting souvenirs of the worst atrocities to beat a path to their front porch in the morning. Wars, famines, assassinations, blimp disasters, epidemics, celebrity suicides, mass graves, bombs dropped here, hostages taken there, sieges, explosions, congressional witch hunts, threats of nuclear annihilation, and shockingly for two devout Michigan Republicans, a seemingly endless obsession with Newsweek and the Muskegon Star's coverage of Waco and AIDS. The box of horrors was pure and unmitigated. As I neared the bottom, I hoped to unearth one solitary piece of good news. Peace, or war over, or man on moon, or even President Gerald Ford welcomes granddaughter. There lay only pink insulation balls that the mice had pilfered for winter nests. Ross wore 3 tie clips along the pocket of his button-down. Legs relaxed into the instability of her antique chair. I tossed the newspapers and magazines back in the box. I don't want any of it, I groused. It wasn't about me being the slighted grandchild, or at least not only that. The bizarre context of the box ate away at my impression of my grandparents, as preternaturally kind and oversweetened lemonade drinkers who sent mildewed, perfectly timed birthday cards and hugged at different ages at the doorstep in every snapshot we had of them. The fact that my grandfather didn't throw away this particular box when even the photo albums were missing and presumed discarded only confirmed the sinister double life that began to superimpose itself over my memory of them. I pictured my grandfather hurrying in with the morning newspaper, stomping his boots of snow on the mat. Look, Gene, a famine in Ethiopia, or the Challenger exploded in midair. My grandmother advancing from the kitchen, steering around the walnut sideboard, blue veined hands clenched in mirth. Quick, you fool, add it to the box. Of course, it could have just been that he simply didn't have the heart to go through those clippings one last time. My father took enough notice of my disenchantment to inform me that I'd never be happy, wouldn't be, and was just like me to see the worst in every gift. I tried to explain that it was technically impossible not to see the worst, that was all that was there, the absolute worst. But he was too busy working at the deal to sell the house and land to the farmer next door. The neighbor would absorb the 40 acres, demo the residence, and keep the barn for storage. On the last day, driven mad by our own arguing in the quiet, polite weather of Michigan, we collected in the rental car as if it were a Manhattan life raft. If anyone wondered where the newspapers and magazines went, they didn't ask. I'd return them to the attic to await the mice and demolition crews. That's a little slice of a very bizarre family. Thank you.
I know weird grandparents.
Is this working? Is this working?
Let me.
Oh,
Here,
is this working?
I'll test this
Do you
one.
mind if I sit down instead of standing? I feel more comfortable speaking to you all. First to say, what a wonderful turnout for these 2 beautiful books. And I'm so happy for them both. They're just wonderful books. I think that they've been very. Sorry, it doesn't. Is that working?
Oh, yeah, I think you have to just shove it right up to
I
the.
was a bit surprised by the chasteness of the selections that they chose, because there was some both in both books wonderful, sexy, tender, passionate, romantic love scenes. But for some reason, they must think that it may not be appropriate.
That's true.
These are 2. Let me say this: Chiara was my student some years ago. Since she said the same thing of me when I came to talk in Rome, when she introduced me, I would say the same that she said to me about me. She walked into my classroom with several of the students, and I thought first, I hope she's not in this class, because I can't avoid staring at her all the time. I'll just be so embarrassed, and I will be so humiliated, and she'll feel awkward. So I turned my gaze away for about as long as I could, and then everyone went around the room saying their names, and she said, "My name is Chiara Barzini," and I said flippantly, "Oh, are you related to Luigi Barzini?" And she said it was my grandfather. And I said, I had lunch with him in Rome 30 years ago. That began the friendship. Whenever I have a young writer that I speak to or introduce, I always claim that he or she has been my student. So with Chiara, the claim is authentic. With Chris, I wish it were true.
Oh, you can say it. Yeah.
These are wonderful books. I know I'm not selling, I'm not promoting it from any personal in financial interest, but to say really and truly, beautiful writing, and with impact, feeling, culture that goes behind it. They're amazing to me because they're books that they're very devious because they started a certain way, and you think that's the focus of the book, and then they switch on you and they trick you in the most beautiful way. You're going through one door and there's a side door, and it's a big surprise. Masterful writing. Not only that, but what I find now I think I'm old enough to pontificate. What I find lacking in so much writing is wisdom. That there's something that the writer has lived and learned and experienced that isn't judgmental and it isn't moralistic, but it's wise. It's seen life and it says something about it. This is these two books. Now, they're in different guises. One seems like a memoiristic novel, one seems like a thriller. But that's like saying, a thriller is like Simenon. When Simenon writes these seemingly surface detective books, they're filled of real worldly knowledge, feelings about people. That's what I find in both these books. They're wonderful books. And I think you're going to be thrilled when you start reading them. You'll see how terrific they are. So I am supposed to ask them questions and involve them in some, but I don't like to do that because it's so boring. I want to talk about myself. Having seen our president do the same last night or the night before, if he can do it, why can't I?
Talk about yourself, Frederic.
These two, I got thrown off balance, so forgive me. To say another thing is, these two are so impudent, I should get the word is, that I thought I was going to prepare some questions and have some discussion, but they thought probably I didn't have the knowledge to ask them these questions. They actually provided me with them. I find it both thrilling in one way and kind of ridiculous. You little upstarts, how do you dare? But they did have some good questions. They had some very good questions. Not what I would have asked. I would probably have asked more heavily academic ones, such as each of you. What would you say? I'm just out of my curiosity. I don't know if our friends here would like to know the same things. What would you say, for example, in the world of cinema, reading, poetry, painting, literature? What are those things that made you grow and focused you and gave you a certain vision of what you wanted to do as a writer? Either of you.
Why don't you start?
Are you happy to answer that question, or is that just too?
I'm happy to.
Okay.
But do you want to ask first, or me to? Go for it.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, you know what I mean.
Probably we do go back to my grandfather, who was a writer and also writing by Rizzoli. So he was my first sort of literary hero. I would go to his studio and I was surrounded by books, and there were English language books and Italian language books. So I thought, that sort of became quickly part of my curiosity. Film, I grew up in Italy, so there was the echo of the great Italian cinema from the 70s, and a great deal of sort of passion for that kind of neorealism, and obviously the sort of fantastical side of Fellini, and this immense creative freedom that he provided for generations of filmmakers to come, including probably right now Sorrentino, who's having an amazing moment with his films, and who's clearly sort of citing and giving his own props to Fellini. Anna Magnani, real people, real women, real people. Anna Magnani is definitely an amazing, hero, and it's so banal to say that because it's like, of course, Anna Magnani, but really she, to have that kind of extreme power on the screen and extreme beauty, not at all beautiful, completely goes against, how we see films today and what films are like today. And I think that there's a comeback right now of searching for realness and authenticity in film, certainly in television. In literature, I'm not really sure, but I do see that there's a lot of interest in the television world for the authenticity of writers and of books that tell a kind of real life. So Italian film. great film called Brutti, Sporchi, Cattivi, ugly, dirty people. And that's just such an amazing, dirty film. You can't believe this film was made in those years. If you see it, it's just the most. We think we're writing about dysfunctional families. Oh my God, these people are beyond. So I try to go back to that moment in time, and I think Chris has some of the same, I don't know if I should call it nostalgia, but definitely an interest for a real time, and we both have a big passion for sort of older, wiser people, and we have mentors, and we honor people who have had real experiences and who talk about a real moment in life. So I think those are some great sort of film examples on my end, and maybe Chris can answer some of his own.
Oh yeah, I'm just gonna say that I think that obviously reading when you're little, you become a lifetime reader early on, and when you say you want to be a writer as a kid, it just means that you want to be part of the world of books, and that could end up being a reader or an editor or any sort of just being a writer ends up being a sort of a different path, but. There's so many books. I mean, I want to talk about film though. When I was a kid, I feel like I grew up in the first generation that had cable all the time. So many movies from like 80s horror films to sort of as I matured into my teenage years, maybe more sensitive and academic choices. But they all sort of horror movies do a lot for me still to this day of inspiration. I feel like so much as a writer was sort of allowing myself to be inspired by some of the things that you don't even really expect to be inspired by. And at the same time, sort of break out of the usual narratives that television and film always present. And that's one thing about Chiara's book that I think you do so well and that you kind of hinted at, is that you kind of think you're getting a certain kind of narrative, and you're fighting against it the whole time. So I feel like sometimes as a writer, we've been so trained by television and film on how characters are supposed to respond to certain events or how it's supposed to be structured, that you sort of lull yourself into plots, and you really have to fight against that. So in a lot of ways, I feel like you're sort of fighting the film and television world as a writer.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, when I like especially to infuriate MFA writers, I always, W.H. Auden, speaking of Raymond Chandler, says that there's a town where Philip Marlowe always gets beaten up by the police. I think it's called Bay City, and he calls it the Great Bad Place. And I always describe the Great Bad Place as Iowa. I hope you didn't know Iowa, because it's against my idea of what writing should be, could be, might be, and it's everything that these two authors, I find, are a fight against in their deepest way, in their deepest instincts. I don't want to keep praising them, but it just touches me so much to read their work. Now, since I did present me with these questions, I think I might as well humor them and at least read one of them. But it's interesting that the two of you, you an Italian, although you spent all your youth in America, write about America, and you spend your time as an American in Greece. So there must be this kind of internationalism is interesting, because there was a time that there was an international novel, Henry James, people like that. What is it that you find particularly attractive about writing the place other than the place you were raised? I mean, it's not true of all your books, but in this particular book. And knowing it so well.
Yeah, it's funny. I started out, my first novel was set in Manhattan, and then I went to Long Island, so I just went a day's drive away with that. And then finally was able to jump across the ocean. I don't see myself coming back anytime soon. I don't know, I think there's something, part of me wishes to be the sort of Graham Greene writer that's always the travel writer. Certainly travel is a big inspiration, but I actually think, in a way, I need to be surprised by a place. I'm such a place writer, so I kind of need a place that I don't know very well and sort of research for the first time. I mean, so many writers do such a great job with one small town that they never leave, and they can do that. I feel like I kind of need to, I live and feed off of newness in a lot of ways with a location. So that really gets me excited. And when I travel, I start hearing sentences and I see details that I want to include. So for me, it's really just such an easy way to sort of get that enthusiasm going.
I want to know what your research process was, because Patmos is known to be a very sort of hot vacation place, and you're kind of writing about hot vacation people. And I want to know what you were doing in Patmos. Were you just like hanging out with millionaires and being like, I'm just going to eavesdrop on your conversation and put it in a book in a year? Or what did you go through when you were there, or is that even where you went to research the book?
Yeah, I did. I went to Patmos 3 summers, and I know it sounds like really light research. And I did spend a lot of time with millionaires and billionaires because it involved boats. And in fact, at one point I desperately needed to know if the border between Greece and Turkey was porous. If you take a boat from Bodrum into Patmos, which is in Greece, if they customs checks the boats. I had no idea. As someone who was, raised by construction workers in Ohio, I have no idea if they check yachts in the Aegean. So I just brought it up, and I happened to be at dinner, and this Italian billionaire said, "Let's go." Turns out that there's a Nobu and that his wife wanted to go to in Turkey. So we went. We just got onto this yacht and went, and they don't check if you have a nice boat, and you can just sort of go back and forth. But so some of it was sort of spoiled research and really wonderful, but also great details. But a lot of it was just talking to the locals, the Greeks who lived there year round. And there's also a monastery, so there's this whole monks, these sort of very dark monastic order that lives there. And so even on a small island, there's so much research you could do. And the problem with it is, once you finish a book, you can't go back. And I'm still hearing stories about Patmos from people thinking like, oh, it was such a good detail. I could have used that. So it's endless, really.
When did you understand that you had to write a book about it?
They've cut me out of the operation.
Yeah. Frederic had to leave, guys. I'm so sorry.
Enough of me already.
No, but Chiara, you should talk about America. So why did you set, as Frederic asked, why did you set? I work at a magazine called Interview. I can't help it. You know the question.
Okay.
I said it in Los Angeles because I lived there. I lived there not in 1992, which is when the book was set, but I moved there in 1994. So it was after the earthquake, after the riots, right around OJ. But the earthquakes and the riots had informed so much of what LA was. The way I think about it now is that those early 90s years in LA were like the teen years of LA. So it was kind of like an eruptive city, kind of acne-scarred, hormonal, moody, crazy city. And I think those were really sort of formative years for creating an identity that we recognized as the Los Angeles of today. But I was there during those years, and those things, the riots and the earthquake and teen life were very much part of what I was living. So I wanted to sort of go back and explore that and write about it in the form of a novel. And to do that, I went back and I stayed in a kind of very weird commune in Topanga Canyon and realized that I'm very thankful that I don't have that hippie passion anymore, because I spent a lot of time with mice, a lot of mice activity, and so not yachts. I was always going back doing the B side of Hollywood. So after a while, I was like, okay, research is great, but I'm just, I've had enough of it. So, but yeah, LA was very much part of my upbringing, and it's a place that stayed with me, even though I thought I hated it. I actually realized that I loved it and that I missed it, and that I wanted to write about it because it is a magical place after all. Mr. Frederic.
Thank you. I can ask this question of both of you. Can you still on? Yeah.
Just speak a little closer.
How is it you both write in English so well? It's supposed to be a joke.
Oh, yeah.
Well, know that Chiara's second language is English, and the book is in English. And you would never think for a second that it's anyone who's just sort of trying to translate from their native language into it's an extraordinary thing in itself. I mean, you just have a feeling for it. It's so beautiful. And I'm thinking of those great writers who did that, like Joseph Conrad and Nabokov. I mean, they were just extraordinary in the way that they could just not only adapt to a new language, but make masterful of it, make masterful a language of it. It's extraordinary. The only thing you want to say about your youth in regard to writing, other than what we just said about cinema? Anything else about the influences of your childhood in your work, for example, growing up haunted by childhood? Your book is absolutely.
Well,
By the way, one reason I thought that, I'll tell you why. They're one of the most beautiful, I mean, I can't say beautiful, that's a stupid word. One of the most poignant, touching, and also comic scenes is a deathbed scene in your book.
Oh.
I thought you were going to read from that. I mean, how you turn pathos into something that's comical in a way. I mean, that I find I'm trying to get them interested.
Right,
in them to
right.
read the
Thank
book.
you.
Who wrote Prince of Tides? Who was the writer for that?
Pat Conroy.
Pat Conroy? Well, one day Pat Conroy was talking to an audience, and he said about his father growing up with this terrible father of his, and how when he's at his deathbed, this reminds me of your deathbed scene, because when they say to you, what did you do to him? What did you
Right.
do to him?
They're not
It's
very
so
nice
great.
to.
I won't tell you the rest. It's a teaser. But Conroy said that his father's dying, and no one liked him. The children didn't like him, and his sister was going over the bed and saying things like, "Dad, Dad, don't die, Dad." And the father said, "I'm dying, but I'm not deaf." But how you can convert that wonderful moment you have in that book, I thought it was just so absorbing, so great.
Thank you.
What other questions you have for each other? You can entertain each other now.
No, well,
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 Let's
you
talk
know,
about
I know
this
there's one
deathbed.
question you both asked me, and I don't know if anyone would be interested except me and you, maybe, I don't know. The decline of Europe,
yeah.
the decline of European culture, the decline of what, I'm sorry, what?
I said, do we have time for that?
We have, I'll change it, the decline of the West. I'll make it larger in scope. Because obviously you both have Europeans in your deep system, and there must be something about that Euro magnet that attracts you, something in the culture that attracts you. And so do you feel now that it's as absorbing as it was, let's say, the time when the people like Camus were writing and Sartre, all of us were absorbed in French culture? That sort of seems so far away now.
This is going to sound arrogant, but actually it's just a case of the book being smarter than the writer. Is that there's a line at the beginning of my book that I thought was very smart after I wrote it. It's almost like I didn't mean to write it that way, but it made a weird sense to how I feel about Europe, which is that Europeans have a lifestyle and Americans have their lives. And there's something I think about the European lifestyle or of culture in that it seems so much more settled and so much more masterfully it creates characters and people in a way that America still seems to me, perhaps the way Henry James saw it, in the way that everyone goes to Europe to sort of be refined or learn about their true self. So in a way, I feel like there's always the decline of American culture, and European culture is a sort of standard that Americans still look to. So I didn't really see it as a decline of European culture as so much that America's never really had a full culture or anything. It does have a culture, but it's so varied and it's so bits and pieces of so many different things that I feel like that's sort of the expat dream, is to sort of be a part of something that's has so much history to it, so much refinement.
I think there's definitely a decline in the sense that Europe is. Europe is very Americanized now. Romans are resisting Uber. The taxi drivers are having, rallies in front of the airports to say we can't have Uber. But there's a lot of things that are sort of taking over even our own, sort of deeply rooted culture, and so we're trying to resist or trying to keep still exactly the way we are, which is very Italian, let's not change too much. I don't like to change neighborhood, I don't like to change the bar where I have my coffee in the morning. I like things to stay the way they are. But at the same time, it always surprises me when I go back to Italy after I've been here for a long time, how there's some sort of irresistible qualities that you kind of, it's nice that they don't change, that's when they say Rome is the eternal city, maybe in all its decadence, it's still nice when you go to the bar and the guy that makes your coffee knows the way you like your coffee and gives it to you exactly in the same way every morning, and it's still nice, when it's the 15th of August, which was the date that the book was released, that the entire country shuts down. It's Ferragosto, there's nothing happening. You walk down the street, it's empty, there's no people, there's nothing. So when they told me your book is going to come out August 15th, as an Italian, I was like, shit, this is terrible. Oh, that's how much they're valuing my book. I get it, But these are sort of punti fermi, we say, these things that don't change about Europe. And even if it is decadent, and even if it is losing a lot of its identity, there's some things, the way that the light shines, these majestic ruins that have been there forever, that are sort of comforting, I think, in a way. So yeah, decline, but also yay. What do you think of the decline? Because Frederic was just in Rome presenting his work at the John Cabot University, and he was very grumpy because he would walk around the streets like, did that place close when I was here?
When
years ago.
When Rome was built.
I can't find my old barber shop, and you have no idea how the Locarno has turned into. And there's no good Italian food in Rome anymore. You just can't get a good pizza. So maybe you have a little more to say about the decline than I do.
I'd rather propose that I discuss this on a more higher level, more intellectual level, because I do have. This is what I want to say. When I'm in Europe, I want to be in America. When I'm in America, I want to be in Europe.
That sums it up.
That's it.
Yeah.
But the thing I was thinking about when I spoke about European culture is that my generation, now the violin, have you have a violin? In my generation, we prized European authors. We thought about them as a powerful thing in literature. And when Gide was writing, and when Sartre was writing, when Camus was writing, when Pavese, I guess, was finished, but all those European writers, Italian and French especially, and then later on Günter Grass, people like that, they meant an awful lot to us as Americans. They seemed to be doing something that was brave and strong that most Americans' contemporary fiction wasn't doing. So that's what I meant. And now I see that that's so distant. I mean, I don't think there are probably fewer and fewer books published in America that are in translation from Europe. That wasn't
few really important
so
ones,
very,
right?
maybe a few, maybe, right? But I think there's not that much. But to say again, on your particular observation, when I was in Trastevere, I felt I was in Williamsburg. I felt I was in Dumbo. I felt I was just like Kidsville. And it's true, because that place has become a place, like in Barcelona, a certain place, just for young people to congregate, meet each other, get drunk, drink, and fall over bridges. I mean, this will tell you everything. I don't speak very well. I don't speak in a good Italian, but I speak a little bit. And I was talking to a waiter, and he said to me, "You don't know how things have changed," he said, because 30 years ago, 40 years ago, no one would come to an Italian restaurant and ask for a pizza. I mean, no one did that. And now, these old restaurants, these venerable, they have signs, pizza, because that's what the tourism has destroyed the quality of the food, the enjoyment of the food. I mean, they say to me, basically, they come here off the buses. They don't know, we give them anything. They don't care. So that's depressing to me, and that's global. I think that's wherever tourism is crushing places. And there's a whole piece about Venice. They're begging for people to not come because they destroyed the ecology of the place. But that's what can we do? That's just living. It's life. But when I'm in Europe, after a while, I think, God, I want something raw. I want rawness. I don't want this little cafe. And no, give me a big juicy hamburger. Give me a, you know what I mean? Give me some noise. Give me street traffic. Give me stuff. I miss it. That's my whole conclusion. Now, before we leave, maybe you'd like to open some questions to the group here and say some things. Please.
That's all right, I'll just grab the mic for you.
Can you hear me?
Well, we will soon.
Can everyone hear me?
or we can repeat it if
Yeah.
we have one.
Hi, I appreciate you guys. I like all your stories. I find them very intriguing and different. And the question I have for you guys, and just listen to this. Okay. When you're writing with candor, do you find your vision majority of the time to come to fruition and helps your inner voice and a sense of nirvana?
Okay.
How is my inner voice? No.
No.
How do you find your inner voice and your sense of nirvana?
No, I guess it's just very thick what I wrote. Basically, I'm saying you find when you write with candor, so it's kind of like whatever your vision is, whatever you're going for, whenever you write anything, a longhand type or whatever, and your vision in your mind to come to fruition when you write honestly, and do you find that it gives you a nirvana? Like
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so I do think that. I think that when you write honestly, and you're always supposed to write what you're sort of more afraid to write, and I think that really is true. And in fact, I had a moment of writer's block during this book, and a great friend of mine, writer Kate Schatz, said, just write that scene that you know is important and that you've been putting it off for a long time. And then I did. I just wrote that scene, which happens towards the end of the book.
Yes.
And it kind of unblocked something. So I do think it's important to take risks and to write in a way that comes from a scary place.
Does this work? Okay. Sometimes I think that actually all of my writing is sound based. It's almost like I know when something is working by the way it reads when I write it. So yeah, sometimes I experience like I got it, I nailed it, but it's almost like I nailed it because it comes off right. It's almost how I know that it works. Sometimes you can write a sentence over and over and has so many thoughts in it, and it just doesn't sound right. It doesn't lead to the next sentence. It doesn't come from the last, and then it's just so frustrating. Then you run into writer's block.
So
But
that's part. Do you find like more per se when you just write it like from the way you know it, from the perspective you know it, like not so much for someone else, another writer or another person, but you just write it the way you.
no one's gonna like my answer to this, but I actually don't believe. Like the problem with writing is that everyone thinks that they need to find this voice inside themselves. I actually don't believe that at all. I believe you have to develop a voice outside of yourself that has nothing to do with your inner emotions. It does. It connects to it, but it's not like everyone has a writer inside themselves and only if they could tap into it. It's like, no, you actually have to like create synthetically a voice and make it work and run. It's a very unpopular notion, sorry.
There's someone over there. Back
Yeah.
there. Hello?
It's work, yeah, for sure.
Then I think we have to sign.
Do you think there's a fundamental difference between European fiction and American fiction, and has that affected your work?
I guess that's what I was trying to ask.
I do think there's a fundamental difference between European fiction and American fiction. I also think that there's a difference between certain, whatever countries in Europe, because there's a difference even between Neapolitan fiction and Roman fiction. So probably, between Italian fiction and Norwegian fiction, there's a big difference. Actually, there is, because we can see a very big emergence of Scandinavian writers right now. But what I do think is definitely present in American fiction that is maybe a little bit harder to find, especially in the more sort of Latin parts of Europe, Italy and Spain, Portugal, maybe France, is the possibility of being a little bit more raw, the hamburger version of fiction, and taking more risks and being more naughty and using a language that's a little bit more daring and a little bit more direct, which I think is already something that is sort of inherent in the English language that allows you to be a lot more direct. And I always say this, but the Italian translation of my book, which I just finished translating, is a little bit longer than not a little bit, kind of significantly longer than the American one, than the English language one, because there are no one words for things, so there's a lot of concepts that have to be explained. So I think that in itself, the idea that you can get to an image or an idea or a thought or an emotion and have a shortcut to it is really precious in the English language.
I feel like this is maybe better for you to answer because you have more knowledge.
To what question? I forgot the question. I forgot the
European
question.
versus
I forgot the
American
question
fiction.
because I was thinking about something, to go back to both of your books, which is, I'll get to that point in a second. But I think you'll see what I mean, my drift of my thought about this. Isaac Singer, a writer I just revere, Isaac Bashevis Singer. When I was a kid, I know about his work, and I thought, oh, he's just going to tell, Bubba Mice's grandmother's tales, and he's going to be just like another, he's going to be like Chagall, like some kind of like decorative Jewish law. And then I began to read him, and I realized what an incredibly powerful, amazing, strong, ravishing writer he is. And then I started to follow him. I read almost everything I could find, because he has something brilliant, which is, and I think I find in both your books, that's why I wanted to say this, you get into the story right away, you absorb the reader right away, and once you've caught them, you can do what you want with them. And I think they both have achieved that. It's extraordinary. Singer was asked once in an interview, Mr. Singer, what do you think about Marcel Proust? And he said, oh, does he make you want to turn the page? And I think, it sounds, it's, because you want to turn the page. And people say it's a page turner. It seems so cheap. It's always a page turner. It's like a good read and all those cliches. But you do want to turn the page in both your books and be absorbed by them and want to know. E.M. Forster said the greatness of all storytelling is, and it started, he makes up a story, it started around a campfire when people were telling stories. Someone said, then the lion came up to the edge of the forest and stops. And then Forster says there's a pause. And then everyone says, and then? And then is the fulcrum of all fiction. And I think both of you have both the wisdom of culture, as I said before, and thought and feeling, but also the and then, which is a really powerful and beautiful thing. I don't know what other question it was I had. Some last thing. We have to close up a little bit because I think we have to sell some books, right? Sign some books. I mean, I shouldn't say so. Sign some books. I'm so rude.
And then?
A boy. So, what do you think, Rosie? What do we do?
Yeah, let's wrap up.
We wrap it up.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming, everyone. Good to see you all.